Cool. Right. Well, I haven't had the notification that it's recording, so I'm assuming it's there. We go. It's recording. So now everything that I say, I have to be legally accountable for, right? So let's get the easy things out of the way. Microsoft rocks. That's on tape now. So that's all good. So um, it's great to be here. Thanks, Scott, for inviting me over. It's late in the day here in the UK, so it's just after midnight here in the UK. But it's actually an early day for me because I spend so much time talking to like engineering folks in Seattle and stuff like that that I'm often up pretty late here. I work a kind of crazy day, so I'm all hopped up on sugar as well, being diabetic, so I'm nice and energized, and I've got some water, no alcohol for me in the week, so hopefully we'll have no dramas. Um, I've got a session today. It depends really. Sometimes if I get a bit rambly, it might run long, but probably 40 minutes, something like that. Nothing too frantic. It's what I call a practical session, and any of you that have come across me over the years will kind of know that I do two types of sessions. Ones which I call practical sessions, which are just kind of me talking about concepts and stuff like that. And then there are other sessions I do that are deep dive or hands-on sessions that I have lots of demos. So the great thing about governance or the concept of governance is there's not really a whole heap to demo. I could sit here and bore the bejesus out of you with all kinds of demos of pulling levers and flicking switches in different admin centers and stuff, but it's all pretty boring. And let's be honest, it's pretty hard to run through a session like that in anything less than like a whole day. This session is really kind of just uh, a quick wash over some concepts and kind of some of the stuff that either as ProvisionPoint or in my daily life as a consultant, I'm kind of seeing, working with customers, advising, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully that'll all make sense as we go through. I think the great thing about this session is it's part of a continuum of sessions that I have as well. So fresh for 21, I've been working on some recordings of about 5 or 6 hours of content that kind of is the wider subject matter around this session. And as I always say to folk, and some of you that know me will know that I'll always reach out to like the user group leaders and say, look, here's the links to the content, here's any passwords you need, because if you come to a user group and see me do something, that, as far as I'm concerned, that gives you free access to anything that I do, so that you don't have to pay for it at Pluralsight or somewhere like that. So I'll send the links over. Once that's all done, I'll send that to Scott, and then send it out to the user group list, and hopefully somebody will get some use out of it. So if I skip forward, hopefully PowerPoint will play. Just to give you a little 30 seconds on who I am, for those of you that don't know me, I kind of describe myself in a strange way. I don't have this long ass description around myself. I'm kind of 51% a dad. So 2 kids of my own, 2 kids of my partner, and 2 dogs. So I've got 6 children is the way I look at it. I'm 23% consultant, and dependent on how PowerPoint plays, it either puts consultant on 1 line or 2, and today it's decided to put it on 2. And in my consulting life, I work mostly in defense, aerospace, aviation, and pretty much have done for 25 years, something like that. So I've working with customers, the Ministry of Defense here in the UK, and the Department of Defense in the US, various other defense organizations. I've worked for NASA, SpaceX, Boeing, various airlines and stuff like that over the years. So although my experience is quite broad, it's quite focused into quite a specific area. I describe myself these days as 14% soldier, because I used to be a soldier, and not anymore, but I was a reservist until quite recently. But anybody that's been in and around the military will know that once a hat, always a hat, and you kind of you take away learned experiences, and they become embedded and part of who you are as you walk through life. And even now, as somebody who's older, wiser, and definitely more carrying more weight than I used to. I still say things pretty much constantly that are military in context, which is fine for my defense customers, but everybody else thinks I'm bonkers when I ask them to do something, and I ask them or use an expression or terminology that's military in origin. And then from a personal perspective, I'm 12% chef, and that's because I love my food. You don't get to be as stout as I am without loving food. And again, those of you that follow me on Facebook or Instagram or anything like that will know that I'm pretty much constantly putting photographs of things that I have grown, killed, caught, cooked, and enjoyed and eaten and shared into the socials. So if nothing else, and people keep telling me that if nothing else, if you're not interested in anything I ever talk about, it's worth following me on social media because of all the delicious food posts that I post up. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a framing around who I am, where I come from. Let's kind of dig into it, right? So I kind of, those of you that have seen sessions of mine before, you'll know I kind of do things in a pretty simple way, right? So let's kind of go back to basics a little bit and kind of think a little bit about what Microsoft 365, and for the purposes of today, I'm just going to use the expression Microsoft 365. It's also too complicated now with, is it Office 365, is it Microsoft 365, is it this, is it that, is it Azure? I'm just going to use a generic term, Microsoft 365, and what I mean by that is, cloud services that your organizations and your users are consuming. It's as good a label as anything else. So what is it for users? So if we kind of think back to basics, the interesting thing about the Microsoft 365 construct is that it's realistically no different to what Microsoft has been providing for the user community for decades on premises, right? So if you think about those of you that have been around the world of SharePoint, for instance, for 20 years now, we're 20 years young in the SharePoint world. SharePoint's always been about this kind of communication thing, a coordination thing, the collaboration thing. People sometimes call that the 3Cs. Broadly speaking, if you think about what Microsoft 365 does, if you ignore some of the veneer and additional layers around security and stuff like that, communication, coordination, collaboration is still what it's all about. If you think about what SharePoint Online is, or what Teams is, or what Viva is moving forward, even to some extent what technologies like Dynamics are, which are obviously off to one side, but still relevant, part of the Microsoft cloud. It's all about communication. It's all about telling people things. It's all about coordination, getting people latched and docked together in whatever they're doing. And it's all about collaboration. It's about getting people to work together and getting them to work in a way that's beneficial to both themselves and to the organization, right? And fundamentally, that hasn't really changed for 20 years. And if you think of it hasn't changed for 20 years in the context of the technologies that Microsoft have. But if you think about what organizations do, those three things pretty much have been the norm for, since the Industrial Revolution, right? For hundreds of years, that's what organizations do. And at a macro level, if you're feeling a little bit philosophical, that's just what people do, full stop, right? People communicate. We talk endlessly about good stuff, bad stuff, meaningful stuff, meaningless stuff. We coordinate endlessly. We're organizing things. Hey, let's go meet here at this bar, or let's all get on a plane and go to Disney World, or or whatever. We're constantly coordinating, organizing, getting each other onto the same page, and whether we like it or not, we're constantly collaborating, right? You think about a company that makes flatware. They're if they're making plates and cutlery and whatever, it isn't one person who does something end to end. There's somebody that digs clay out of the ground, and then dum 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 dum, and there's a whole sequence of events that come together in a collaborative way, so that a company that makes plates can make plates, right? And it doesn't matter what it is that an organization does. It doesn't matter what it is that people do. It's always the same thing. So that's kind of the 365 context for users. And I always find in any governance discussion, getting these frames are quite important, because I think it's, when we start talking about governance and when we get onto what it is, or what it could be or what it should be, understanding the context of what it is we are governing is important. And one of the things that I find that often it gets kind of ignored is what is 365 for the organization. Because if we think about the hopes, dreams, desires of people, and the necessity of workforce and the necessity and utility of people inside an organization, what they're doing and what they're looking to achieve is different to what the organization is doing or looking to achieve, right? And I don't mean that at a, deeply, peace out man philosophical level. I'm just saying, organizations, businesses, profit-making organizations, not-for-profit organizations, government organizations, whatever, they have a different set of C's. So the 3 C's for an organization is different to the 3 C's for the workforce inside that organization. And, over the years, it's kind of, it's kind of ground down in my mind to this notion that it's about cohesion, continuity, and compliance, right? And cohesion is about making sure that your workforce is aligned. It's about making sure that your organizational intent and your workforce within that intent are, to the best of all possibilities, pulling in the same direction or pushing in the same direction, dependent on the metaphor of how you do work. And it's making sure that everybody's on the same page, to use the expression that's probably the most commonly used to describe what that means, right? So this cohesion concept is kind of super important for an organization, but to many employees, to many people within an organization, is kind of somewhat lost. People often have a view that they just do their thing and they're just doing their thing and that's what they do. But of course, at an organizational level, making sure that they're doing it for the right reasons, in the right direction, with the right docking to other people and other groups, other departments, whatever, all matters. And then the second one, this continuity piece, is about, making sure that an organization survives troubles. And, that can take many forms. If you're interested in things like records management and stuff like that, then continuity might take the form of, good planning and good assurance around corporate memory or something like that. Making sure that the organization could survive if 3 members of the board of directors were on an aircraft that, dropped out of the sky or something like that, or whatever form that might take. Act of God, or factory fire. There's a zillion scenarios that we could think of that might impact an organization. And it doesn't matter whether it's a tiny organization, whether it's 20 people or whether it's 20,000 people. Microsoft 365 provides mechanisms for an organization to be, to have continuity and maintain contiguous operations regardless of what happens. So you think about things like COVID as a pretty decent example. The technologies there which are allowing organizations wherever possible, organizations in industries that are able to carry on working, the ability to, for instance, send everybody home, so that the workforce or a good chunk of workforce can work from a different location, a remote location. That's a good example of providing continuity to an organization, where before that might not have been possible. If you think, if COVID would have hit even 10 years ago with significantly less ubiquitous capability for remote operations, it would have been potentially very painful for organizations to have a remote workforce in that context, apart from organizations that were 100% information worker already geared up with remote access capabilities and giving everybody key fobs and all that kind of stuff. I mean, if you can imagine what that would have been like, trying to issue key fobs and manage them, and people not losing them, and people's dogs not eating them, and children not flushing them down the toilet and whatever. 10 years ago, COVID would have been significantly more dramatic for a significantly larger percentages of organizations. And then, the third C in an organizational context is around compliance, right? So it's about the ability to provide tools and capabilities that can keep organizations, in England, we say on the straight and narrow. So to keep organizations aligned to both their own organizational policies, they're both organizational contexts, as well as statutory frameworks, government frameworks, whatever the rule space. Banks need to be adhering to financial things. Healthcare organizations need to be adhering to things like HIPAA, FedRAMP and things like that for government organizations. Here in Europe, GDPR, stuff like that. And compliance is a pretty big part of these 3 C's that Microsoft 365 can bring that matters in the context of an organization. So, hopefully those, the kind of 3 C's for users, 3 C's for organizations, hopefully that makes sense. And what it does is it gives you a bit of context around why kind of governance matters, even though I haven't got to the governance bit yet, because we're getting a grounding, a basic understanding of what it is that 365 is doing for an organization and for the user community, other than being email or SharePoint or something else, right? Hopefully that makes sense. So why are we doing it? So let's start to think a bit more now about what governance actually is and what it means and why it's important to organizations. I always kind of, when I'm stood here or sat here kind of in front of an audience kind of presenting, this slide is a lot less impactful than if it was in kind of a workshop type environment where, I could ask all of you here, give me your view on what the objectives of governance are. But broadly speaking, I tend to get a very similar set of answers from most people when we're talking about what the objectives of governance are. And you kind of get broadly boils down, sometimes not quite as smoothly as this, but it broadly boils down into 3 things, right? Is being able to control features, being able to control users, and being able to control data. I guess there's no right and wrong answer around governance, and that's one of the things that makes governance such an emotive subject, is that there are no right and wrong answers for any given organization. There's no magic answer. There's no magic one size fits all. There's no Cinderella boot, Cinderella glass slipper that works for governance. But what I can tell you is that control is absolutely not what you're after, right? Without a shadow of a doubt, if you're thinking about governance as being a way of providing, leveraging, or improving control, that's not what it's about, right? That's not the objective of governance. It might be a byproduct of good governance, but it's not the purpose. It's not the reason why you want governance. And the reason is because governance isn't necessarily about control. In many places, in many contexts, governance manifests as control. And I'm not necessarily saying that's right or wrong, but in most contexts, you shouldn't be seeking to have control as your output of governance, right? Now, some would argue that that's just me being nuanced around a specific word, because it depends on how you interpret the word control. But let me give you a slightly different perspective on kind of what the actual objectives are. And again, consultants like me are really good at twisting things and twisting words and turning expressions on their head. But the actual objectives for most organizations and for most people around governance, and again, this list is pretty much endless, but I'm just giving you a couple of examples here so that you can get a flavor of where I'm coming from. It's about the protection of intellectual property and assets. And, if you think about, depending on who and where you work, if you work in, in a profit-making business, generally speaking, intellectual property, something like that, is, a very important facet of what governance provides to an organization, right? Data assets as well. Human resources are need protecting, and intellectual property isn't just about code and algorithms these days. It's about all sorts of stuff. It can be just about things that people know in their heads. Now, we all know that it's not ideal for an organization to be reliant on people in the context of what it is that they know. We want to try and tease that out and expose that into a form that can work for the organization. I mentioned earlier on about continuity, but as an actual objective of governance, we want to be in a position to be able to protect intellectual property and to protect against the risk associated to loss of intellectual property or sharing of intellectual property or data assets and stuff like that. We want to be able to guide users. Now, one of the terms that's being used increasingly amongst kind of governance professionals is to exchange the word rules for guide rails. Now, I kind of swerve and yin and yang between thinking that's great and thinking it's not so great, because, you know, the metaphor is really easy to understand. You know, you think about when you take a small kid to the bowling alley and the little bumpers come down in the lane so that the ball can never go off the side. You know, that metaphor of a guide rail for users is pretty solid, and you know, it kind of makes sense and kind of resonates to most folks. But the challenge with that is that it forgets about in the metaphor of bowling, you've got to get the ball onto the lane and you've got to get the ball back again once it gets off the end of the lane. And your objective is you're trying to actually hit pins as well. So, you know, guide rails kind of works for me, but in some contexts it really doesn't. But the key thing that matters here is you want to be able to just guide our users through things rather than telling them things, rather than giving them, you know, hard and fast, you know, hard rules, hard entry points, hard exit points, hard junction points. In how they're doing their work. And if you think about, you know, there's some really simple examples of where hard barriers were put in the ways of users. The example that I nearly always use when I'm talking about this is mailbox sizing in on-premises Exchange estates. You know, back in the day, we probably all remember, probably everyone on this call is probably long in the tooth enough to remember having a 50 megabyte mailbox or something like that, and knowing that frustration of every few weeks of having to dump stuff out of our mailbox because we've run out of space. And you know, the reason that you know, the reason that hard piece of governance, if you will, existed was not because organizations wanted to restrict users from having email or from keeping email. Perhaps they should be, but that's a different philosophical discussion. The reason they did it was because storage and Microsoft Exchange infrastructure is incredibly expensive to maintain on premises. And so if you had 10,000 users, you know, each with a 50 megabyte mailbox each, you know, you needed a lot of very expensive fast storage to make that work. You needed a lot of infrastructure to give you resilience across your DAGs and your mailbox servers and all that good stuff. And so kind of, you know, I often used to use the expression false governance used to come into the mix, because what would happen is that a very hard limit would have to be imposed in order ostensibly to manage cost. And very few organizations did value exercises to understand whether the cost of giving people larger mailboxes actually would have benefited the business. And so nowadays with Microsoft 365, and we have mailboxes that might as well be infinitely sized. Number one, users are happier. We can put that on the table straight away. There's zero cost associated to that, or not zero cost, but it's a negligible cost to the organization associated to having these epically sized mailboxes, because Microsoft now manages the infrastructure for us. So there's no cost of storage, there's no cost of management overhead associated to that. Sure, we pay our subscriptions, but if you think about just Microsoft Exchange as a use case, the cost per user per month, even at a very large scales in Microsoft 365 for using Exchange, it might as well be free, right? It's just a very, very inexpensive solution to use. And it's not until you start looking at other facets of Microsoft 365 that the cost starts to mount up. But anyway, I could ramble on about that forever. But the point that I'm making here is that we want to be guiding users rather than controlling users. That's the thing that really matters. And then this third one, which I think is important, but it's also quite emotive, and we'll come on to why it's emotive a bit later on. But is, you know, we want to be able to enable compliance, and compliance, like governance, means lots of different things to lots of different people. And so, you know, it's hard in a short session like this to get too deeply into the construct of what compliance is. But if we just think about being able to give an organization the opportunity to adhere to a rule space, if we just think about that as a simple way of looking at it, and it gives an organization an opportunity to come up with a rule space that isn't bombastic or arduous, because the technologies either are very clever, they allow us to do some very smart things with things like auto classification and sensitivity labels and things like that, or they allow us to just provide, for instance, much simpler mechanisms of keeping data forever, or keeping data under specific life cycles, time-based life cycles, or something like that. So it enables compliance in a relatively simple, very cost-effective way. So hopefully that all makes sense. Let's start to look at kind of how. What's somebody got here in the chat? Let me just have a quick look in the chat, because. Yeah, taxonomy. Oh, we'll come back to taxonomy in a bit. Some of you that know that I spent a bunch of time working as an information architect for the US government, and my golly gosh, the taxonomy subject, we could do like a 3-day meeting just on that, just trying to come up with an agreed definition of what it is. We could spend 3 days just doing that. But I'd be interested, whoever it was that first mentioned taxonomy, is what the context of why you brought it up. So understanding whether that was around use of taxonomy to enable application of governance, or whether it was, what that context was. So whoever it was that typed that in, drop that into the chat window so that we can look at that for a little bit, because taxonomy is one of my favorite things, but I don't want to get too deeply into it right now. So let's keep skipping forward in the content that I've got here. So let's start to look at, so one of the things I'm not going to do today, which might upset you, it might surprise you, it might, you probably have consultants and speakers in front of you all the time that are trying to convince you of their version and their definition of governance, right? What I'm not going to do for you today is I'm not going to give you my definition of governance. And the reason is because although governance is spelt the same way for everybody, it means something different to everybody. And I could sit here and try and convince you of what governance is until I'm blue in the face. And in my slides here, if I go back one, what I prefer to think about, and what I want you to think about, especially if you're embarking on a governance journey for an organization, is to think about what you're trying to do rather than what it is. For instance, if I'm Usain Bolt, I'm not thinking about running, I'm thinking about winning gold medals. It's as simple as that. Or in his case, eating McDonald's as well, which we were talking about earlier, because Usain Bolt famously likes a McDonald's, right? And if you think about sports folk as an example, Pete Sampras never used to think about hitting tennis balls. He used to think about winning Grand Slam tournaments, right? Serena Williams at the moment, she doesn't think about hitting tennis balls. She thinks about winning tournaments, right? She's thinking about objectives and outcomes rather than trying to come up with a definition of what it is that she's doing, right? And that's something that I very much believe in. Oh wow! Somebody said ontology. Good grief! Scott, I'm coming back for another session where we can talk about ontology and taxonomy. So, is somebody here saying that ontology is greater than taxonomy, or they're saying that ontology leads to taxonomy? Explain yourself, whoever typed that in. And then the response here, ooh, I like it. Okay, so ontology is greater than taxonomy. Yeah, possibly. Possibly. We might come back to that, depending on how we're doing for time. We might come back to that, because I think it's a bit more nuanced than just saying ontology is bigger than taxonomy, because the basis of that assertion is that an ontology is a taxonomy of taxonomies. I think I'm assuming that's the angle that you're coming from. Get the popcorn. Yeah. But the practical reality is it's obviously it's potentially a bit more complicated than that. But we might come back to it. We might come and do another session to talk about that, because that is one of my absolute favorite topics of discussion. Right. I said I'm not going to give you a very clear, Seb says governance is this, not least of which because we're being recorded, and I don't like saying things like that and then somebody pulling me up on it in 3 years' time, right? What I want you to think about, and what I want you to ponder, and this is the reason again why I described this session as being a practical view, is to think about some stuff and how it matters to you. And this is equally applicable if you're inside an organization and you're responsible for 365 or governance around 365, or if you're a consultant and you're just providing advice and implementation around concepts such as governance. There's a whole bunch of stuff that you want to consider. Now, the thing that's interesting about this list of stuff to consider is that it's not particularly earth-shattering, right? I'll let you into a little secret. It's not earth-shattering. Okay, there's nothing super clever in any of this, right? That's the great thing about governance. It's mostly just common sense, right? But as I say, there's nothing like, there's no eureka thing that I'm going to give you here, right? The first thing you want to be thinking about in the context of and these are in no particular order, right? So, one of the things you want to be thinking about in the context of governance in 365 is about licensing, right? And the reason why you need to be thinking about this is, of course, will be apparent, I hope, to most of you here. If you're on this call, I should hope you've got more than a passing understanding of the complications and the nuances associated to licensing in 365. Like all things, right, there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? And if you've got a $5 a month per user SKU, you're not going to have anywhere near as much functionality as if you've got $100 a month, per user SKU, right? If you've got E1 versus E3 versus E5 versus E3 plus right, whatever, right, you're going to have all kinds of different I've just shattered somebody's world, sorry about that. Oh, is that the UK, Darren Hemming? Wow, somebody else is up late here in the UK. What you're going to be able to do in the context of governance. And when I say in the context of governance, what I mean is about the manifestation of the governance that you wish to apply, how that manifests as features and functionality inside your tenant will be governed in an ironic twist of fate by the nature of the licenses that you have. Okay. As we all know, there are some way smarter folk than me who could spend hours, days, weeks, months waxing on lyrically about the nuances and complexities associated to licensing, right? The only advice I ever say to people is, as far as I can tell, generally speaking, the higher the number, the more it costs. Yeah, so if you've got E1, it costs one thing. If you've got E3, it costs more. If you've got E5, it costs more. When it costs more, you get more, right? And broadly speaking, when you get more, what Microsoft are giving you is more and more and more integration into tooling that exists inside Azure or advanced integration tooling, advanced and integrated tooling that exists inside Microsoft 365 natively, right? And it's just important to bear this in mind. One of the challenges that organizations have, and I know I've come across over the years many organizations and many people that have been quite frustrated because they've seen people talk up, stand up in front of them and talk about very clever things, so things like, automatic classification of data or automatic application of sensitivity labels or, other types of things that are clever, that would take the heavy lifting, take the burden of applying, for instance, data governance, loss prevention type governance, take the burden of doing that away from the user community, away from the admin community, but it only exists in certain forms if you have higher levels of SKU, more expensive versions of the licenses, right? The only advice I'm going to give you here is use your common sense, right? There's no such thing as a free lunch. If you're on inexpensive licensing structures, you're very unlikely to have a lot of the advanced functionality, but it is worth exploring what you can add rather than upgrading license types. I'm not a license expert by any stretch of the imagination, but when you start to think about what it is that you want to do in the context of governance and how you want to put these guide rails around your user communities, these guide rails around data, the guide rails around your intellectual property, is do it the right way round, right? And this is why the licensing thing for me is important. And this kind of lends itself into the culture piece, right? Do it the right way round, right? I'm constantly frustrated by customers who try and shape the technology to meet what they need, right? Work out what you need and then see if the technology can do it, right? Do it that way around. Don't restrict your thinking based around the technology, right? It is always going to be much more useful to you to say, right, this is what we want, right? Figure that out, right? Then this is how we would manifest that using the technology that we have, right? And it might not be possible to manifest it. You might need to buy more advanced license types, or you might need third-party tools. At that point, you can then do a value business justification exercise to say, in order to have what we need, is it worth spending the money, right? If you say, well, let's just take what we have and hammer it into shape, you'll never ever get those two things to match up, right? I'll give you an example, and again, I promised at the beginning I'm not going to try and sell you anything, but you know, the company that I'm involved in, which is ProvisionPoint, it offers it's a third-party tool, right, that offers a bunch of stuff around lifecycle management for Office 365 workspaces and permissions, right? So provisioning, compliance management, and a bunch of stuff that's outside of what you get if you have Office 365 advanced SKU types. And you know, when the ProvisionPoint guys are selling the tool to potential customers, what they're always saying to the customer is, this is what you get out of the box. This is what you get if you had all the amazing stuff that you could have inside Microsoft 365. But ProvisionPoint 365 gives you something in between, which is way less expensive, and gives you bits and pieces that you need. But don't buy it if you don't need those bits and pieces, right? It's a piece of mortar that goes in between two bricks. And if you don't need the mortar in the bricks, don't buy it, right? It's as simple as that. And obviously there is tons of other third-party solutions for Microsoft 365 around backup and archive and records and, you know, whatever. You know, there's tons and tons and tons of it. The point I'm making is that if you don't know what it is that you want, you can't determine the most cost-effective way of delivering it, right? So I'll leave it there on that particular subject. Culturally, and I kind of dipped into that, and I'll dip back out and dip back in again. Think about the culture of your organization. You know, I know a handful of you on this call. I know you, and you know, people who have experience in the military and things like that will recognize that culture in that sort of world is very different to culture in industry and in the private sector, right? In an armed forces military context, you can tell people what to do. So you can say to people, we're going to do this, we're going to introduce this, deal with it, right? Other types of organizations culturally are, everything is done by committees, everything is done by steering groups, everything is done by unions, or whatever. And so culturally, if you go from having very little governance, very little guide railing, very little you know, mechanisms and measures for governance, right, and you attempt to introduce things, that might be a really difficult ask, and you might have to think about what that on-ramp looks like in order to drive it through into the user community. And that then leads me on to the third bullet here, which is around how are you going to adopt governance, right? Now, adoption of governance is something that's really, really, really close to my heart, because there's tons of material out there to help organizations adopt Microsoft 365, right? And you'll hear about, you know, organizations and constructs and frameworks that talk about having champions and, you know, all sorts of clever stuff. And I agree with all of it, right? Most of it's absolutely awesome. And there's some awesome people out in the community, MVPs, RDs, speakers, community leaders, community members who are generating some amazing content and some amazing concepts around how to improve adoption of 365, right? But ultimately, most of the technology that's in 365, most of our users have been using throughout their careers, right? 365 is just a melange of stuff that people have been using forever, right? Everyone's been using email forever. Everyone's been using Microsoft Office forever. Everyone's been using SharePoint or NTFS file shares or other sharing, you know, or other storage systems forever. And so the adoption challenge in my head isn't actually about adopting Office 365. It's about adopting how an organization wants you to use Office 365, right? And guess what? That's governance, right? So you need to be thinking about, you know, how your organization culturally adapts to change, and then how that culture can be mapped onto how you can make the adoption successful. And that might involve things like training, that might involve things like, champions programs, floor walking. I was recently talking to a consulting customer of mine, who took a view that they basically did a lottery and sent 25% of their workforce. It's a pretty big organization. 25% of their workforce on a 3-day familiarization training course, and they literally did it like a Powerball lottery, where they just put everybody's name into a big bucket and pulled out. And what they did was they felt that huge investment, it was a huge investment, commercial investment in training, served them really well, because they had enough expertise in the organization. They reduced help desk calls, they reduced frustration, they increased productivity, and all these measures and metrics that organizations of this type use to see how effective they're being, to see how efficient and productive they're being. I mentioned earlier on about doing value analysis and cost analysis. This organization decided that this multi-million-dollar investment in training would pay off, and boy, did it! It really did. Think about that in your organization, and it doesn't matter if you're 20 people or 20,000 people. Think about how adoption of governance and training around governance will be implemented inside your organization, because I'm not convinced people need a whole ton of training around how to use Outlook or how to use email or how to use SharePoint. I accept that's a controversial statement, and I was recorded saying it. Think about roles and responsibilities, right? And what I mean by that is, if you think about back to the old days, technology systems were the guardian, the guardians, of technology systems were the IT folks, right? The bastion of IT was the IT people. And let's be honest, I don't know how many of you on this call are IT folk versus how many of you are kind of business or power type. But IT folk aren't famous for being the most communicative, the most literate, and the most able to express an opinion amongst all of us, right? And I can tell you for one thing, if there's one thing that you take away from this session today, that is that in order to help your organization understand why governance is there, the benefit of governance and what's in it for them, you need people that aren't technology people. You need people that aren't technical in order to make that happen, simply because the conversation is much more human. And let's be honest, us IT people, we're not really human. I mean, I've already given you the percentages of how I see myself. Not one of those percentages was human, right? And roles and responsibilities around, how does the user community interface with the management community? How does the management community interface with the senior community? How does the senior community interface with the technical community? And then how does the ontology, see what I did there, of all of those communities come together so that there's an appropriate mesh? Anyone who had Ignite Mesh as a buzzword, you've got it. How do those communities mesh together and come together and work for the organization in the context of making this governance both purposeful, with points, so it's got to be purposeful. How do they make it effective? How do they make it not so bombastic? How do they make it guidance versus control, and the things I've spoken about earlier on? You have to really think about this stuff, right? If you don't have senior sponsorship, this about almost everything to do with technology, right? If you don't have senior sponsorship, there's no point even trying. It's not going to work. You need folk who can interface, with each other. You need representatives of your different communities. You need representatives of different user types. If you're an organization that's, task worker and knowledge worker and information worker, you have to be able to bring those communities together, bring those vocabularies together. You need glossaries and translations and heaven knows what else, so that across the organization, the implementation of what that governance looks like makes sense and empowers the organization to succeed, right? Sounds great. Human, so overrated. Alien. I love it. You know what, right? On a complete rambly sidebar here, someone was saying to me the other day, the best definition of the term human was made by the Killers. And if you know the song Human by the Killers, you will know that song makes no sense. therefore it's the best definition of human. So I buy that. Where did I get to? Roles, responsibilities, and then expertise. Now, this is a potentially a controversial one, because as a consultant, I'm not here to try and sell you myself or services that I provide or anything like that. As some of you know, I'll happily get on a plane and come and talk to you about all sorts of nonsense almost indefinitely once COVID is gone, because I love to travel and I love to talk. Think about how the expertise that you have within your organization can function in the context of this implementation and this manifestation, this determination around governance, right? If you don't have the expertise to do it, bring it in, right? I have seen so many organizations, especially larger organizations. Smaller organizations seem to figure this out, right? But I've seen so many very large organizations mumble and struggle away, or try and hire people in with governance job titles and things like that, rather than just recognizing that a simpler version of events might be to just bring in some consultants, bring in some expertise, give them a very strong mandate that they have to make themselves redundant in a very short space of time. They shouldn't become permanent members of the team. Or bring them in on a mandate of saying, look, we need some help at the start, we need some help in the middle, we need some help through the continuum towards the end, as we get into a maintain phase. But don't underestimate the value of investment in expertise, right? What form that might take will vary hugely dependent on the nature of your organization, right? For some organizations, expertise might be in the form of real knowledgeable folks like records managers, compliance managers, people who have deep experience in any statutory or regulatory rules that you have to abide by. They might not necessarily be governance people, they might be people who are just experts in regulations or statutes that you have to abide by. But look at that expertise. There's an amazing pool of talent out there. I've recently been advising even very large enterprise customers to look at what's available to them through the gig economy as well. This kind of transient workforce. I've come across some very smart people who are consulting in very non-traditional ways using platforms like Upwork and Fiverr and stuff like that. And it seems like a rather daft place to get or consume, hardcore expertise from. But the gig economy is doing something that consultants who long-term place don't benefit from, which is the gig economy gives consultants who work in that way an opportunity to see lots of variation. If you think about, when you work with consultants who come from very reputable companies, the McKinseys, the BCGs, the Deloittes of this world, many of them go into a customer and stay there for 5 or 6 years, sometimes longer. And one of the great things about consultants, external consultants, is you're buying variety of experience as much as their knowledge. And think about things like that. There's some real, as Darren's written here, bring the right folks to help teach you, right? There are some smarter folk on here that would know the books of the Bible better than me, but it's the teach a person to fish rather than give them a fish model, right? And 10 bonus points, and I'll send you a ProvisionPoint hat to somebody that can tell me what actual parable and what actual is that the feeding of the 5,000. I'm not sure, but if somebody who can tell me what that is in the chat, there you go, I'll send you a hat. But expertise is not to be sniffed at, right? There's definitely a place, I would say, simply because governance is a fast-moving world. It's a moving target. It can be quite industry specific, and the likelihood of you being able to find somebody or find a team of people that fit precisely into a Venn diagram that you need, I would assert, is quite slim. And so looking to consultants is almost certainly the way to go. And then teach a man to light a fire, he'll be warm all night. Set a man on fire, he'll be warm for the rest of his life. I don't know if I've ever met you, Joe Dunn, but I think you and I would get on pretty well. And then the final thing I've got here is I've just got power in quotes, and the savvy amongst you will know what I mean by that, right? the world is a changing in Microsoft 365 and in the Microsoft Cloud software as a service offerings with the introduction of all this powerful stuff, you know, Power Apps, Power Automate, Power this, Power that, Power the other. And I have, you know, nothing but admiration for, you know, the types of opportunities that the Power Platform brings us. You know, the democratization of development, the democratization of system design, the democratization of data storage and data management. It's all fantastic stuff. And oh my golly gosh, it is fraught with so much danger, it defies belief. You know, I believe in democracy. There you go, I said it, right? And I believe in the fact that there is absolutely a place for the democratization of system design and system delivery. You know, the citizen developer is potentially a very powerful member of any organizational workforce. They're also arguably the most dangerous member of a workforce. The opportunity to build things without the discipline that traditional software engineers have, and the experiences that software engineers have about risk and cost. And by cost, I don't necessarily mean financial. I mean things like processing power and stuff like that. You know, without the discipline of understanding how to test, without the discipline of understanding how to maintain source control, you know, yada, yada, yada. I think it's fair to say that the powerful new stuff has its own set of governance needs that you need to be very mindful of. I talk to organizations all the time who are, should we just give Teams to everybody? That's the extent of their concern. And they haven't even looked around the corner yet at whether the Power Platform is something that they should or could deliver to a broad spectrum of their workforce. He-Man, Master of the Universe. Yeah, absolutely. You know, the possibilities are endless. I know some of you on this call, you know, folks like, I think Anton has done some pretty smart stuff with the Power Platform that I've been aware of, and I know others. You know, there are some amazing manifestations of stuff. I know the guys and gals at ProvisionPoint. You know, Power Platform is used for lots of customers for providing things like dashboards on things that are going on inside organizational tenants, simply because you don't need to deploy expensive solutions like Tableau or ClickView or something like that. It's kind of stuff that's available out of the box. But there are challenges there. It's a session in its own right, without a shadow of a doubt. But something you absolutely need to be thinking about. You know, the world is changing. Microsoft, rightly, I believe, are pushing more of the responsibility out to the wider user community. They're enabling the creation of loosely coupled systems, non-monolithic systems, so that risk and dependency around individuals, design, and stuff like that can be diminished. But they're creating a new set of risks and a new set of challenges. And without reasonably careful thinking, reasonably careful governance around how you keep an eye on that, all hell can break loose. I can't quite see on the trouble is I've got this two giant 6K monitors, but because they're 6K monitors, I can see Churchill. Thank you, whoever put that in there. Thank you, Scott. I can see Churchill. I've got no idea what he's saying because the writing is so teeny tiny, but you know, is it Spider-Man, Peter Parker, his uncle, with great power comes great responsibility? We just need to get a handle on that. You know, anything that you're allowing your communities to do with the Power Platform, you need to govern it, whether you like it or not. You need to get a strong arm around it. You need to have decent processes before solutions are available to wider user communities. You need to have processes, governances around how data is being moved around, how data is being stored, how data is being copied, whether it's authoritative, whether it's no longer authoritative. And all of these things are the sorts of things that citizen developers have no knowledge of because they're not trained in the disciplines. There's a Harry Potter metaphor in here somewhere about dark arts and spells and potions. I'll come up with it and I'll let you know another day what I'd come up with. But these are the things I want you to be thinking about. These are things I want you to be considering. Right. This is the bit that's I want you to think about, right? I've got a couple of constructs here. The first one is the secret sauce for organizations. As I said to you before, I'm not going to give you, I don't have a secret magic answer that's this is how to do governance for you, right? This is about scaffolding. This is about frameworks. This session's about making you think, about giving you some points of direction, and then opening up a conversation. Somebody's just written here, governance starts with the conversation. Chrissy, you couldn't be more right if you tried, right? That's, that's the bottom line, right? Is all governance, in fact, all human interactions, it's the beginning of time, starts with the conversation, and there's no reason why governance is any different. And the answer is it isn't any different, right? The secret sauce for organizations, I've given you the 3 C's. We've spoken about the 3 C's. Is the 3 I's, right? Innovation, or innovate, inform, iterate, right? If these are the 3 words you take away from this session and the British guy lathering on with his stupid Stranger Things hat on, right? If there's one thing that you take away from this session, it's this slide, right? Governance is about innovation, right? It's about innovating what works for you as an organization, whether you're big, small, left-handed, right-handed, top-heavy, bottom-heavy, information-focused, task-focused, it doesn't matter, right? You have to innovate around your organizational needs. You have to be mapping together rules, regulations that you need to adhere to, policies and mission and vision that you might publish as an organization, user, community, culture, your financial capabilities. All of these things have to be brought together, and you innovate governance. You come up with a starting point, and then you inform, you let the community know, you roll it out, you manifest it as technology, whatever that might look like. And it might be levers and switches that you pull and tug on inside Microsoft 365. It might be written policy that you give for people around usage and abusage and stuff like that. Whatever form that takes, it doesn't matter. It's unique to you. And then you iterate. And this is the bit that matters, right? Iterate, 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 right? I used to be fond of saying, and in fact, there's a foreword of one of the SharePoint books that I'm involved in back in the day, where I say the most insightful thing I've ever said, which is that SharePoint is not a project, it's a continuum, right? And the great thing about that sentence is I can apply it to almost anything, right? Q is not a person, he's a continuum. Little Star Trek joke for you there, right? But the point is, governance is not a project, right? It's not a function, it's a continuum, right? You have to innovate, inform, iterate. And guess what? When you iterate, you go back to the beginning, you innovate, you inform, you iterate. You go back to the beginning, reset, innovate, inform, iterate. It's governance Groundhog Day, right? But the thing that matters in governance Groundhog Day is the innovate, is the bit that keeps it relevant, the bit that keeps it working for you, the bit that keeps it fresh, the bit that keeps your users engaged and not so pissed off. It's that innovation and how you do that. And it's about ensuring that it's relevant, that it's focused on those outcomes I spoke about. So get rid of the mindset of control, get into the mindset of guidance, of organizational objectives around protection, organizational objectives around compliance, etc., etc. Innovate, inform, iterate. Maybe I should get some t-shirts made, and anybody, if you think it's a good idea, I'll get some t-shirts made, wang it into the chat, and I'll see if I can get some made, and I'll get a box of them sent over to Scott, and he can or I'll tell you, actually, when I come over, I'll come and deliver them to Scott when he takes me to go and eat kimchi, and we'll bring a box of those t-shirts for you. So that's my secret sauce for organizations, right? The holy quintilogy for users. Now, I am not suggesting dill pickle crisps. I love it. I'm not suggesting this is the only thing you need to do, right? I often talk about, people often pin me down and they're like, okay, Seb, you're fair enough, dude. You're not going to give us the answer because the answer is different for every organization. But what are the things that you think that we should definitely be looking at, right? This is what I call the quintilogy for users, right? This is the first piece of guidance. Wear that t-shirt every day for a week. Sold, right? I will get the t-shirt people at ProvisionPoint on that in the morning, right? But this Holy Quintilogy, obviously it's a play on Holy Trinity, but these are the 5 things that I'm about to say something that sounds ridiculous. These are the 5 things, and if you only do one thing in governance, these are the 5 things you need to do, right? You need to look at your Microsoft 365 implementation, your Microsoft 365 usage, and think about provisioning, external access, naming conventions, privacy, and compliance, right? Now, I accept that that's potentially an interesting and lengthy list of stuff to look at, because although it's only 5 things, it is a quintilogy after all. There is potentially a lot of subject matter inside that when you unpack, but you can keep it pretty simple if you try, right? So think about provisioning. How can a user create something? Under what circumstances can they create it? It's simple, right? External access. Should external users, guest users, whatever, have access to things? Should users have the ability to grant that access? Nice and simple. Think about naming conventions. We've all come across test 1, test 2, test 3, test 4, test 5 as either site collection names, team names, group names, whatever. You can enforce naming conventions through policies and through various other bits and pieces. Clearly, there are some rules around licenses for that, but think about naming conventions, right? If you map that onto provisioning, you can create some, decent mechanisms for guiding users around naming things in meaningful ways. When I used to do a lot more, when I used to do many more sessions around things like development when I was engineering back in my youth, I used to talk to people about write code and comment code for who you are in 6 months, not who you are today, so that when you come back to something, you can look at it and immediately know what it is, right, and understand what it is. Naming conventions give you the same benefit in the context of sites, groups, teams, right? Think about privacy, right? Privacy, right? And what I mean by that is slightly different to external guest access, although that is the same, it's a similar subset. Sorry, it's a subset of privacy. Think about how users can share and collaborate on information that they have inside Microsoft 365, right? I am both for and against, for instance, private channels in Teams. I think the very notion of Teams and the very notion, the very philosophy of Teams is that the concept of a private channel shouldn't exist, but I do understand the use case for a private channel, right? So think about privacy, think about, is Teams the right answer for certain types of collaboration? Should you really be using SharePoint, right? Think about OneDrive, think about what people can and can't do with OneDrive. And then compliance. This one is potentially a big and hairy one, and I do accept that. It's very easy for me to be trivial and flippant and just say, think about compliance, right? But, if you want to have some overarching rules, maybe tenant level rules or something like that, that determine and improve your compliance stance, then think about what those might be. Now, they might be complex things, such as sensitivity or classification or something like that. Or it might be very simple things such as, a lock, a lock is placed on every piece of content that's published as a major version or something like that, so that it can never be deleted, or, whatever that might look like. But also think about what you might have to manifest in the context of statutory or regulatory compliance. One of the challenges I know lots of organizations have with 365 is bashing it into shape to meet regulations that they have to adhere to. Clearly, regulations and compliance aren't necessarily the same thing, but think about use cases where, for your organization, for your industry, for your own business intelligence purposes, whether things like discovery, search, those sorts of things, whether they need to be molded, configured, improved, whatever. Okay. So, somebody here has got a, so let's have a look. Yeah, so Tina, naming conventions needed when you share your tenancy with the entire org. I mean, absolutely right. The vocabulary, and, communications and the, up until quite recently, URLs are it, right? Once they're set, they're set. And you're in trouble, and renaming and stuff like that for certain types of objects, workspace objects, is very tricky, right? So yeah, absolutely. And then a private channel use case, I don't believe it. Space and managers from the department of team are saying if there's yeah, again, I agree with you, Darren, there on the kind of that use case for a private channel. But again, I would assert that in that particular use case, use SharePoint. Don't even be inside Teams at all, right? Which is kind of my point. Is there's kind of a nuance to the two tiers of the philosophy of SharePoint versus the philosophy of Teams. But you know, I don't want to unpack that too widely, because we'll be here forever. And if you are the Darren I think you are, and you're in the UK, it's getting pretty late here. So so hopefully that quintilogy made some sense. If the one thing you're going to do today, do those 5 things, or if the one thing you're going to do around governance, do those 5 things. I've been rattling on for more than an hour now, so I've just noticed that. Let's just try and wrap things up for a little bit. The key thing I want you to think about is not overthinking, right? And my pause was dramatic and deliberate there. Yeah, you need to think about governance, but don't overthink governance, right? It's better to act steadily in small increments and to introduce things as you go along, than it is to try and sit down and waterfall governance into your organization, right? If you try and sit there and and come up with an enormous 300-page binder of stuff, right, you'll never manifest it, you'll never get approval. There'll be a zillion reasons why you can't get it, right? Whereas if you act on those basic things, act on the holy quintilogy, act on a few things, start to get your thinking together, start to build a team of people who are communicating and coordinating and collaborating on what governance looks like, and then you start to innovate, inform, and iterate. Wow, I knew Joe and I would be best friends. There you go. We're BFFs forever now. I've got a graphic. I'm grateful in the extreme. I'll shoot you a T-shirt or a hat in exchange for that graphic. So that's awesome, right? You'll be familiar with the term analysis paralysis. Governance is a great subject for organizations and for people to just wrap themselves around an axle and just become paralyzed. This kind of analysis paralysis problem. You need to think, but don't overthink it, right? You'll find that governance is a thing that if you just kind of ease it along, it'll just emerge, and you can then iterate around it, you can innovate around it, and it'll happen naturally. Trust me on this, right? I guarantee you it will happen naturally. Governance is almost the perfect use case for agile working, agile thinking, right? If your organization is very used to doing things in a very waterfall mindset, governance doesn't, sure, if you're head of governance for a bank or something, then you probably need something over in this side of things. But the reality is most of us aren't head of governance for a bank. It's almost a perfect use case for thinking in a more agile way about how to introduce policy, if you like, into an organization. All right. Think about what you need, not what you want. Think about what you need, not what's possible inside the technology. Think about what you need and always map that onto why there's, what's the organizational benefit? What's the user benefit? Why do we need it, right? Every time somebody says need, you need to tear it apart and unpack it. Why do you need this, right? Just, endlessly, if there's one thing you do in technology, full stop, is endlessly unpack anytime somebody uses the word need. Just tear it apart, peel it. You'll get down to the little P in the center of it, and that will always be the correct answer, right? And then just execute, right? Just damn well get on with it, right? Don't think too much. Don't just don't become obsessed with thinking, right? Just execute. Right. I don't know what's going on. My slide deck presentation, it didn't like the reader mode for some reason. That email address there, seb@provisionpoint.com. I'm not going to, I already mentioned, I'm not going to try and sell you anything ProvisionPointy, right? But that is my real, genuine, legitimate email address. There isn't some PA reading that or some AI bot reading that. That will come directly into my iPhone or into my Outlook. If there's anything you want to talk about, anything you want to discuss around that, feel free to shoot me up an email. Any questions you've got, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, all the usual places, Instagram. Seb Matthews, you can find me. You can Google Bing me, and you'll pretty much find me. Luckily for all of those platforms, I'm an early adopter, so I am the original and best Seb Matthews on most of them. That's it. Any questions?
I was scared for a minute that your
I love it. You can't explain it simply. You don't understand it well enough. I love that. Einstein. There you go. Say no more. But yeah, I mean, if there's any questions, I don't know what your schedule is for the rest of this session, Scott and team, but
no, that's really it. I'll do the wrap real quick, and if anyone wants to sit around and chit chat, you're more than welcome to. But I will hit stop in just a minute. Wanted to put out that I've sent out a couple emails to the meetup email address, and I'm just wondering if people are getting them or not. There have been a lot of job announcements. I'm constantly getting hit up with private sector, government, some with security clearance, some without, some taking green cards, some U.S. citizen only. If anyone's looking, hit me up directly. You got me on Twitter. It's Scott at spsuperheroes.com, or SharePoint Superheroes is my Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever. Hit me up, and I'll make certain that you're getting these emails. But you have to be subscribed to the meetup group to get all that. But
yes, Scott,
yes, sir.
Scott, are you posting in the LinkedIn group?
I did, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Cool. Just making sure.
Yeah. So at this time, I'm going to hit stop, and I'm going to put the title slide that I used before as the front of this for the video for YouTube, and it'll be up in a couple hours.
Well, I'm more interested in somebody needs to